Isn't it amazing how subtle the music is in Bambi? You don't really realize how swept away and enveloped you are by it. Through that music, you actually enter the forest.
It's making nature itself a character and bringing it to the screen in a way that certainly no one had done in animation before, and I think very few people had even attempted to do in live action.
And I realized that it was a pastoral symphony, just as Beethoven wrote, which was something that was in their minds at the time, clearly, because Fantasia was being completed at the same time. The pastoral symphony for children. Every cell that you see, every background, is completely brilliant work. But the impact of a motion picture, the succession of images, of film, is glued together by the music. This is why music has always been part of movies.
There's a beautiful scene where Bambi has fallen down and all the rabbits go, "Get up, Bambi, get up."
Come on, get up. Come on, get up, Bambi. Get up.
And he has a way of getting up with doing one leg first and then the other leg catches up. It's just gorgeous. And that's all done to music. And that unity between music and animation is just fantastic.
That Disney cared so much about music cannot ever be overstated. Music was as important to him as anything that happened on the screen.
I think Walt realized that music was going to have to play an exceptional role in Bambi because the dialogue is so minimal. He would very often make the artists storyboard sequences in mime, and then only at the very last minute could they add what dialogue they absolutely couldn't do without.
From the beginning of Bambi to the end of Bambi, there's almost not a moment without music. There are two 18-second silences. One is when Bambi's mother says,
"Man was in the forest."
And there's complete silence. I mean, 18 seconds is a really long time. And the other time is after Bambi's mother dies. These moments of silence are powerful because they're surrounded by wall-to-wall music.
There were 2 Academy Award nominations for Bambi. Both had to do with music. The song Love is a Song was nominated, and sung behind the credits by Donald Novis, who was a very important singer at that time. And also the scoring was nominated as well.
The main composer behind Bambi is Frank Churchill. His music, his themes, his motifs were taken and then arranged into the final score. And Edward Plum did what you would call secondary scoring. Plum was a musical director for Fantasia, so when you hear some of his music in the film, it definitely has a more classical sound than Frank Churchill. Frank Churchill had had a huge success with Snow White. He had written all the songs and a lot of the underscoring, and those were songs that were on the hit parade. They were extremely popular. He wrote Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf from The Three Little Pigs.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf, big bad wolf, big bad wolf?
His melodies were very simple, very catchy, and very memorable. He was relatively untrained, but an intuitive natural musician who could come up with endless melodies.
His on-the-job training was to play music for silent movies. What a lot of people don't realize is that when silent films were being filmed, the actors and actresses were being put into the mood of the scene by somebody playing a piano. And Frank Churchill used to improvise the moods for these different scenes. That experience made him the ideal person to set the mood, as it were, for a skunk named Flower or a little bunny named Thumper or for Bambi.
I remember clearly how we were involved with the first rainstorm, and we wanted a raindrop song that would show Bambi experiencing the first raindrops. And we didn't have anything at the time, and finally Frank Churchill came in one day. Frank was quite a character. He shuffled down the hall, and he always wore his hat. And he sat down at the piano wearing his hat, crossed his legs over, and he puts one foot on the pedal, reaches in his pocket, takes out a little script, puts it down on the piano, and then starts to tinkle off on the piano there, this little raindrop song. And it was so charming, it was unbelievable.
Somebody could take a chord and and nothing, but Frank Churchill could take it and... It's the creative genius that Frank Churchill had.
The way he makes us feel nature and yet write simple tunes of all different kinds of qualities is really quite interesting in Bambi. Ed Plum, who was the other composer, is said to have studied with Johann Strauss, which is very believable. There's no question that between the two of them, they create a world of the past, maybe when we might have been closer to nature.
And it's really amazing that the score is so unified, because you have the very sophisticated work of Edward Plum with its echo of Stravinsky and Ravel, and then you have the very childlike melodies of Frank Churchill. You have the main title, which is the Love is a Song theme, which is sung by a tenor, and then you have the music for the forest waking up, and it's just a very simple theme, but very lovely. The man motif, which was just a simple three-note progression down here. And here's a melody that Edward Plum composed for the autumn sequence. Almost every measure of that is a different chord. The whole film just has emotional power to it, generated by the musical score.
Bambi is the first feature film of any kind where songs were sung off camera, not by the characters themselves, in order to pass on the narrative.
When you have less than 1,000 words of dialogue in a film, your ear really hungers for sound. 40-voice choir, 4 individual artists singing beautiful, lovely, melodic tunes. It's a feast of music with this broad-ranging orchestral score.
When you look at Bambi today, you're aware of Walt Disney's seriousness of his purpose in entertaining. What a high level he set. We now are the recipients of this tremendous vision, and we just now almost take it for granted. If you look at it really carefully and listen to it really carefully, you're amazed at how far they push the envelope. I don't think Bambi would be Bambi without its music.
Of all the deer in the forest, not one has lived half so long. That's why he's known as the great prince of the forest.
Bambi the book was published in 1928 and written by an Austrian author named Felix Salten. And actually he did 6 books, 3 of which were turned into Disney films, Bambi, Perry, and then The Hound of Florence, which became The Shaggy Dog.
How does a novel written by a man who works in an insurance office in Vienna, who's bored out of his mind and starts to write the story Bambi, how that gets to Disney is already an amazing story. And it involves, of course, World War II. It involves everything that's going on at that period.
Felix Salten's book came to Walt's attention by a fellow named Sidney Franklin in 1935. He was a producer and director of live-action films at MGM, and his films always had a great understanding of character and story and a lot of heart. Films like Goodbye Mr. Chips, Mrs. Miniver. Salten's book was a natural for Sidney Franklin. He optioned the film rights in 1933, and for a couple of years he played around with making an actual live-action version of the film.
Sidney Franklin liked the book very much, but he didn't think that it was possible to do a picture that had that much emotion with the animals.
So he realized the true medium for making Bambi would be animation, and my gosh, who better in the world to do this than Walt Disney, the king of animation. So he approached Walt Disney with the book.
And the book itself had a lot of poetry and beautiful scenes in it, and dramatic scenes. And when Walt heard about it and read the book and saw what the possibilities were, he became extremely enthused about it.
I think Walt was always somebody he was a nature guy. He liked nature, he liked the seasons, and he liked the outdoors.
And so from that aspect, I think it was very close to his heart, and one of the reasons why he poured so much of himself into it.
This is the kind of film he wanted to make, and it would be in advance. And so he risked everything. He was such a successful guy after Snow White, and he puts it all on the line again, immediately. I mean, who does that now? It's incredible, incredible.
In the early 1940s, they had already done the impossible. They made Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. They had done the next impossible, which is that they had made Fantasia and Pinocchio. The last thing they really needed to do was, like, outdo themselves, and yet they decided to push the envelope one bit forward.
That endless experimenting was very much Walt's personal style.
I always refer to the making of Snow White, where everybody was saying you can't make a feature with animated cartoons. It's not going to work. A lot of people thought that, including animators. And when Walt came in and told the animators, he said, you know, my idea is...
Dwarfs' names fit their personalities.
This guy here, maybe he is grumpy. He'll be different. He's not just another little old man. He'll be a grumpy little old man. And then this man here, we'll make him sneezy, maybe. He'll sneeze.
This little fellow is bashful. He's secretly in love with Snow White.
By the time Walt got through telling him about his characters, everybody's saying, yeah, I think we could do that. Yeah. Well, that's how Walt was.
That kind of restless creativity that was never satisfied, that was always looking a couple of films ahead, I think is very clear in Bambi. And when you see the process by which it was developed, he's still experimenting and exploring and looking for, okay, where can we take this?
This great work of art, Bambi, came from the most chaotic time in the Disney studios. Really, the time that Bambi was in production, from about 1936 to its release in 1942, was a roller coaster ride for Disney in the studios. It was a very tumultuous time.
In 1939, the Nazis marched into Poland. The world was plunged into war. Disney lost their European market. Pinocchio did not make a profit.
It was somewhat of a scary time. I mean, there was a feeling of unease in Europe at that time, and financially things were not all that rosy.
And Walt ended up in debt to the Bank of America.
And he called over Mr. Giannini from the Bank of America, and he came over with his entourage of all the men in the dark suits, and they were all going to stand there and listen to Walt try to sell them on the idea of getting more money into this picture. And Walt started to tell the story. And I've never seen a man sell a story or an idea better than Walt. Walt was the greatest actor at that time. And I saw Mr. Giannini and his entourage watching all of this, enthralled with Walt and the story of Bambi. We got the money. Walt was the best salesman I'd ever seen. In fact, if I had the money, I would have invested in it.
And along about 1940, you have some labor unrest at the Disney studio. It was really a time of union organization, especially in the studios in Hollywood. And with the financial problems that Disney was facing, there were rumors rampant at the studio about potential layoffs. The Screen Cartoonists Guild was run by a real tough, hardline laborer named Herbert Sorrell, whose very name would bring most studio bosses to their knees. He went in with a meeting with Walt and said, you need to sign with me. Walt refused. He said, no, it's not my place to do that. I want to put this to a vote. I'll go with whatever my boys want. Sorrell had lost before on a vote, and I think he realized that he didn't have a majority of the artists. And he threatened Walt with a strike. Walt was adamant he was not going to sign with Sorrell's union unless the boys voted it. Sorrell left, and the situation worsened. Tempers flared until on May 29th, 1941, Walt was surprised the studio had come under a strike.
Well, Bambi was still in the early stages of production and pre-production during the strike, but that was such a watershed in the history of the Disney studio and the history of animation that its impact was felt and still echoes down the decades. I don't know that any of the key artists on Bambi went out on the strike. They were in a different area physically.
We hardly knew that the strike was happening, and I naively just came into work every day.
My sympathy at that time was very much with Walt, when he realized who he was, the origin of his pictures, and to have it taken away from him by the strikes.
And then finally, they brought in a government mediator, and the government mediator settled the strike if Walt would take 2 strikers for every person that didn't go out on strike. And that's what happened to the studio.
Then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. We got in the Second World War.
The war had an enormous impact on the Disney studio.
The war turned our studio into a military reservation. All our facilities were devoted to making films for the war effort.
And actually, you know, the studio was taken over. So he survived that way.
By the time of Bambi's release in August of 1942, the world had been at war for almost 3 years, and the United States had been at war for 9 to 10 months.
I find it maybe an overlaying emotion to the picture, but the idea that it opened in August of 1942 during the war in London. The world premiere was in London, right in the middle of it all.
I mean, Bambi was much realer and intense dramatically than audiences might have been expecting from an animated film.
Well, as a matter of fact, Bambi didn't make a profit on the first release.
Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi all lost money initially. Since then, of course, they've gone on to reap millions, but it took those films a while to be recognized for what they were by the general public.
Walt should have been rewarded tremendously for Fantasia, for Dumbo, for Bambi, but the public was just simply on to global domination.
But Walt was the eternal optimist. Now, even though we have the deer facing trials and tribulations and the loss of his mother, ultimately everything ends up all right. And that was sort of what was going on at the studio, is here Walt was going through all the trials and tribulations of the strike, the financial problems in the war. And I think internally he was an optimist. He felt that everything would turn out right. And that was Bambi.
Bambi's a movie with great poetry and elegance and artistic integrity, but at its core is something very emotional, and of course that's Disney storytelling at its best.
This world could use some of the messages, that little beautiful story of Bambi.
A film like Bambi will never get old. It's timeless.
It really stands alone as one of, the great motion pictures ever made.
People talk about the philosophies, the art value, the animation, and the styling of that picture as being the epitome of the art of animation. Glad to have been part of that.
Hello, I'm Patrick Stewart, and I'm delighted to say that I recently became a member of the Disney pantheon of voice talent by portraying Bambi's father, the great prince of the forest, in the studio's upcoming release of Bambi 2. Over 60 years has passed since Bambi first charmed the world, and it continues to do so to this day. It's a timeless classic, but unfortunately, time has taken its toll on the original film elements. Thanks to the Walt Disney Company's commitment to preserving its timeless treasures for future generations, I'm happy to tell you about the remarkable, groundbreaking restoration that has taken place on Walt's masterpiece, specifically for this Platinum DVD release. Working from the original monaural music tracks, Bambi has been brought into this millennium with a newly created 5.1 Disney-enhanced home theater mix. It gives a vividness and scope to this magnificent score that is unlike anything you've heard before. The end product is the most spectacular looking and sounding presentation of Bambi ever.
Bambi and some of our other classic films, the actual original nitrate negatives are being stored at the Library of Congress film vaults.
Back in the late 50s, early 60s, the library decided to get into film preservation because a lot of the older films were just being abandoned. The film itself has basically the same chemical composition as gunpowder. Once it starts to break down, work has to be done quickly because one day it's fine, 6 months it's a can of powder.
After many years of rest in the Library of Congress, the original negative for Bambi was pulled from the vaults and brought home to Los Angeles to undergo a restoration using today's cutting-edge digital technology.
All film stock of this era decays and becomes unstable, and not to be too dramatic about it, but it quite literally will die. Now, both the digital and film backups that we're going to do on this restoration will ensure its life for many, many, many generations. But this is really now the time to do it while the negative is still in very good shape.
When we start a movie like this, the first thing we do is we inspect the film very, very thoroughly, frame by frame, check the whole thing to make sure there's no torn sprocket holes or rips in the film or bad splices. We use a clean room primarily to make sure there is no dust in the environment, no dirt.
The film is scanned frame by frame at a very high resolution.
Those films were shot on successive exposure film, and so there's 3 color records for every frame. So each one of those color records is scanned.
These digital scans are then put through an automated cleaning process using software to remove dirt and other imperfections.
Well, this is quite an occasion.
Finally, the film is scrutinized frame by frame by an operator who removes any final imperfections that may still exist on the image.
So we're able to go in there and clean up this movie so it's absolutely pristine and still retain the artistic integrity of the movie.
Party.
Once the film is completely cleaned, technicians begin an extensive color correction process. Their goal is to restore the outstanding artwork to its intended splendor and vibrancy.
My responsibility is to maintain the look that the artists who originally made the film intended. The backgrounds in Bambi are, each one of them, a piece of fine art on their own merits.
Referencing the original artwork for the film stored at the Animation Research Library, they painstakingly execute subtle adjustments to the hues, always conscious not to exaggerate the color tones or compromise the integrity of the original film.
The quality of the artwork that was produced for Bambi was pretty phenomenal. So as part of our research when we're restoring Bambi, we look at the artwork very closely and understand the textures and the color so that when we're doing our restoration we can try to make sure we stay as true to that as possible.
The result is an image free from dust, dirt, and scratches with brilliant colors and pristine visual quality, so stunning even Walt himself would be amazed.
These films are treasures. They represent different periods in our history.
Some fun! Huh, Bambi?
Through his endearing films and rich imagination, Walt Disney was able to provide warmth, humor, and entertainment to audiences past and present. Now, thanks to today's remarkable technology, we are not only able to preserve this precious classic for future generations, we have been able to enhance its sound and picture to new heights beyond the expectations of the original filmmakers. I think Walt would approve.
The 1940s were one of the most pivotal decades of the 20th century. In 1942, the world was at war, fighting by land, by sea, and by air. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in the White House, Winston Churchill was Prime Minister of England, and Joseph Stalin, leader of the USSR, was Time magazine's Man of the Year. Those left behind did their best to keep up morale. the USO was formed to lift the spirits of military personnel worldwide. Benny Goodman was leading the band, and Walt Disney was changing the face of family entertainment. Disney Studios had been working on Bambi for 6 years and was eagerly anticipating its release. But with World War II raging overseas, the military called upon Walt to use his facilities to make educational, training, and patriotic films.
Walt Disney orders his famous cartoon characters into battle dress. They're in popular demand as emblems for the armed forces.
Walt complied and halted all commercial production, except for Bambi. Did you know that in 1942, a house in the United States could be bought for less than $7,000? A car cost a little over $1,000. You could buy a movie ticket for about a quarter, ice cream for 15 cents, and soda pop was only a nickel. While big shoulders, elegant suits, and hooded coats were in style, and elaborate hats were all the rage, many women in the U.S. and abroad took to wearing slacks in the workplace. In baseball, the St. Louis Cardinals beat the New York Yankees 4-1 in the World Series. And in boxing, Joe Louis KO'd Buddy Bear to retain his title as heavyweight champ. Television was still in its infancy, so families gathered around their radios for news and entertainment. Couples were jitterbugging on the dance floor, and popular tunes leaned toward the romantic and sentimental. Bing Crosby's recording of White Christmas, heard in the hit film Holiday Inn, was #1 for 11 weeks. The lights on Broadway were dimmed, but not extinguished that year. George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, Irving Berlin's This Is the Army, and Thornton Wilder's Pulitzer Prize-winning play, The Skin of Our Teeth, commanded standing ovations. Movies were as popular as ever, offering escapism, inspiration, and romance. Mrs. Miniver, starring Greer Garson, was the highest-grossing picture of the year and went on to win 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actress.
Greer Garson wins the award for her unforgettable Mrs. Miniver.
Disney released 19 animated shorts, starring Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Goofy, and Pluto. Designed to delight fans at home and honor the men overseas. Promoted as a love story,
Walt Disney, the world's greatest storyteller, brings the world's greatest love story to the screen. Bambi.
Bambi was released on August 13th, 1942, and people lined up for blocks to see the new Disney animated feature film, making it one of the top 10 films of the decade. In 1942, we celebrated the arrival of many men and women who have influenced our world.
Hello, my name is Andreas Deja. I've been a Disney animator for almost 25 years. One of the things I love to do here at the studio is come to the Animation Research Library, where all the artwork for the Disney animated features is stored. Here I can see the work of the masters who worked on the classic animated films, including, of course, Bambi. I'd like you to join me now on a tour of the library and take a look at the incredible artwork that still exists from the original production. I have Doug with me here today, who is a researcher, and it's very important to have some help around here because you need somebody to show you where everything is. So Doug, tell me, I'm looking for some sort of hidden treasures from Bambi. Do you know if you guys have any artwork that might not have been used in the actual movie?
Sure, let's take a look at a couple of these. Here are the story sketches.
So these are actual sketches that were not used for the final film.
That's correct. Yeah. I think they were trying to do a lot of work with a chipmunk and a squirrel, and this is one of the gags that they were working on here. And
so this is the owl listening to them, right? There's something going on down here. And the owl flies down to find out what the racket is all about. And as the owl lands.
And it looks like it upsets their balance a bit, and they're holding.
It would have to. They're barely hanging on, now to the owl's tail over here. And this seems to be a particular artist's idea, because it says Rolf Wright's idea. So he obviously felt kind of proud of this gag. Then the branch gives and cracks. Everybody's gone, and the camera picks him up down in the snow again. Guilty expressions here on those two. You know.
Well, it looks like they had an audience.
Which happened to be Bambi and the rabbits. So I would say that they probably cut this because in developing the squirrel and the chipmunk, you know, you probably focus on too many characters. And the main story really is about Bambi, Thumper, and the skunk.
You might find this interesting, Andreas, the bees, which we don't see in the final version of the film.
I don't recall any bees in the movie, but I do remember they were working on a sequence between Bambi and a bee, where one of the bees was flying to Bambi's ear and ended up in Bambi's stomach. So these might be those bees, actually. But here they're just zipping through and flying along and don't look too friendly, actually. I just can't believe how rendered these are. These would have taken so much time to capture the whole mood, I guess, of the sequence.
Another story element that didn't make the final version of the film.
The grasshoppers. And he even talks to Bambi. He says, "You up there, you almost stepped on me." And then he's actually yelling at Thumper, too. So he must have been part of the sequence as well. And I can't believe how close Thumper here looks like he does in the final film.
He's not even called Thumper. I think he's called Bobo.
Bobo?
Yeah.
Okay, Bobo the rabbit. So when I come to the Animation Research Library to do my research, this is how it works. I come into this reading room, and then people like Vivian, who's a researcher over here, will bring me the artwork to study. So what you got, Vivian?
I've got some story sketches and visual development. So this packet is about the forest, and it has a lot of watercolor and pastel pieces, some of which are of Taiwan.
And look how small they are. He can set a mood and an atmosphere very, very quickly. You know, he doesn't have to do a big painting. And these are also from the sequence that shows the forest after the fire. You can still see some glow and some ashes. And this kind of artwork was done to inspire the background painters. They took the color use from work like this and then made these into big paintings.
Yeah. Over here.
So this is a story sketch, and it's really unusual because when you look at this peculiar shadow over here, this is supposed to be man. And when you think of Bambi, they only talk about man, then you never really see a human figure.
That's right.
So at one point, they were actually thinking about showing man, like in the story sketch over here. So here we are having several versions of the character of Bambi and his mother. And you can see what the animators and the character designers go through, striving to achieve a final style. And they usually start out with realism. Yeah. When you look at this drawing over here, that looks like a rendering of a real deer. There's no caricature there. And the other one that looks real, I think, is this one. Even though it's a line drawing, it kind of has sort of the realism of a real deer. And the same one over here. We're trying to find the pattern for Bambi's spots, and something like this would be way too complicated. This one even still has too much detail. It's a little simpler than some of these, but all these different color separations would also be very difficult to animate. And they're still not humanized yet. They don't have the human emotions. But these Mark Davis sketches then gave sort of the human element to it by putting human expressions onto the animal face. You can see that these eyes had gotten larger than real deer eyes, and the forehead is very big, the eyelashes. Those are all elements that you find in children. And then the stuff comes to life, and then you can say, well, these drawings could talk. So here we are looking at some background art, and this is Anne, who's going to show us some original background from the movie Bambi.
Andreas, we've picked out a few backgrounds for you.
Oh my, look at this one. What really amazes me about this one is how long it is. It would have to be a camera move. So in other words, the camera, if it would start over here, would then move all the way across here, and you might have some birds or squirrels moving through. The thing about Bambi is that the background art is very unique. There's so much left out. It's very impressionistic. And then you have these wonderful accents right here where you have a spot of light and you can see detailed bark. And I would think that we would probably have a character ending up at this spot. So these two backgrounds here are from the fire sequence. You can see that this is all painted in red tones, and it's kept, again, so simple. So what you would have in the final film is the simplicity of this background, and then the animation of the flames going across here, flickering away. It almost looks Chinese, because the Tyrus Wong brought that influence to this movie. So Anne is going to show us some backgrounds that are actually painted on glass.
Yep.
And look at these beautiful pieces of art. And I believe, again, this is from the opening shot where we truck through the forest and we pass by this little lake. And the reason why there are holes in here, and this is not painted, because this is part of a multiplane setup. In other words, there was another layer probably behind this that showed an even deeper, lower background. Look at those colors. Beautiful. This must be springtime. I think this is the beginning of the spring sequence. And here again, that hole over here represents the water coming through, because that would be on a different level. Some birds would fly through. That's why this is so long, because it's a pan background. But look at these impressionistic trees. I mean, just blotches of paint. And yet it all works. And we have Fox over here, who said earlier on he found something very unique.
Hello, Andres. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Alrighty. This is actual Bambi animation that's out of picture. Of the character
it means
Bambi.
that this scene is not in the movie.
Correct.
This was cut.
Correct.
All right, let's take a peek. Cute. And I'm going to put these drawings onto this old peg bar, and then I can flip them back and forth, and we can see some movement. As I'm flipping it and going back and forth, you can see that Bambi is sort of startled. He's looking at something here, and something startled him, and he moves backward. And there are so many subtleties happening here. You can see how, as his head is going up, his ears are going down, and we call that counter movement. For a scene such as this, you would really have to do 24 drawings for each second. And you can see how much detail is involved. Even the spots that are drawn on Bambi have this perspective change. You can see this right away as they're going back behind him and then surfacing again on his rear. There's so much attention to detail. There's probably more detail in Bambi, I would say, than in any other Disney film. Bambi is really more than a movie. It's a work of art. And the more you know about it, the more you will enjoy it.